Now you've probably noticed that some web pages have elements that change in appearance when you move the mouse pointer over them. The most common of these is probably hyperlinks. So here I've got some hyperlinks on my web page. They are purple to begin with, and I move the mouse pointer over them and they change colour, but they also have an underlining effect. So let's have a look at how we do that to our web page. We can actually do that to any element. It doesn't have to be a hyperlink, and it doesn't have to be a change of colour. So let's look at how we do that. So I'm looking at the page that we created previously. We've still got the picture of the rows on it, we've got the headings, and we've got the paragraphs. So here's the style at the top. So I've styled the body and heading 1 and heading 2. So in fact, just to make it simpler still, I'm just going to remove that sizing. So all we've done with our headings is change the colour. Now imagine we wanted to get them to change colour when we move the mouse pointer over them. Not sure why you'd want to do that, but it's a possibility. So all you need to do is create a second style, and then we swap between the styles as the mouse pointer moves on and off that particular element. And the way we control that is with a thing called a pseudo selector, which is hover. So if I do H2 and then I do a colon and then hover, what this style is what H2 will look like if the mouse pointer is over it. So we can do this in the style section on the right, but actually because when we create this kind of rollover effect, there's probably very few changes that we want to make. So remember, we only want to put in here the things that are actually going to change. So we don't need to put in the font size style if that's not going to change. So what I'm going to go for is I'm just going to go for color red, just so that we can see that something's happening. So this is only applied to H2. So H2 is ordinarily this color here, which if you look back at the previous video, you'll see is no red, no green, and some blue. So that's what makes it that dark blue color. And what happens is when we move the mouse pointer over that, so when we hover over H2, it becomes red. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go to the browser, and I'm going to refresh. So now, when I move the mouse pointer over my heading, it becomes red. So that's not necessarily something you might want to do, but you might want to highlight things that people are pointing at, I guess. But it will apply to anything. You can use hover with any element. So that's quite, possibly potentially useful. I'm going to remove that because it's not something I particularly want to do. I'm going to show you now how to use a more, I'm going to say sophisticated, but you might think it's a bit gimmicky, but I'm going to show you a more advanced, more complex thing that you can do. So what you can do is there's a CSS property called transform, and what that allows you to do is a variety of different things, but what I'm going to show you here is how to rotate the object. So I'm going to say rows. So rows is the picture, remember. I've given it an ID so that I can style it. Rows hover, so this is what the rows is going to do when I move the mouse pointer over it. And I'm going to say transform. I'm going to say, so these are all the things you can do, and they've been around a while, so Expression Web can help you with that. I'm just going to use rotate. And there's a variety of different rotates. I'm just going to use the straightforward one, which is just a two-dimensional clockwise rotation. So I'm going to say 90 degrees. So we have to specify the units. So what that means is just literally rotate it 90 degrees. So if I save this, we go back to our page. So the ordinary version looks the same. When I move the mouse pointer over it, it rotates the page 90 degrees. Now what you could do, because that's the stalk on that, you can use transform in a non kind of animated way. So if I wanted to straighten up that rows, because I didn't like the fact that the stalk wasn't straight, I could try and do that. There you go, like so, by just rotating it 10 degrees anyway. So as well as being able to rotate that, so I'm now only rotating at 80 degrees, obviously, because it was rotated 10 degrees to begin with, there's an additional property called transition. And what transition does is it behaves like an animation in PowerPoint. It controls how long it takes for changes to this element to happen. So for example, I can say, and I can specify which changes I'm talking about, so I can apply this to some changes but not others. So I can say transition, transform. So I'm only going to apply this transition to the transform, and I want any transformation to take 1 second. So now what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to go for 370. In fact, what I'll do, just to make it simpler, I'll go for 360 and I'll not rotate it to begin with, so I'll just remove the original transform. There we go. Now you might say, well, okay, if I rotate through something 360 degrees, it's back into the original position. However, because I've said to take a second to do that, if I refresh my page, now when I move the mouse pointer over it will rotate and it will take a second. So depending on what that is, that that might be enough time, that might not be. And you can also apply that to other things. So if we go back to our headings, so if I said H2 hover color red, for example, this is what we did a minute ago. What that does is it just goes red instantly. What we could then do is we could say, notice I'm doing this on the unhovered version. So I'm going to say transition. I'm going to say color. I'm going to make it take a long time. So 2 seconds. That's a relatively long time. So now we can see that the color fades in slowly and fades out slowly. So that can be quite effective. So it applies to things like colors and sizes, as well as transformations such as rotation. Now what I would suggest is that you use these hover techniques kind of sparingly. You don't want a page that jumps about as people move the mouse pointer over it and looks really garish and gimmicky. You can change the background color, but that tends to look a bit strange unless you do it on a div. So sometimes like swapping the background and the foreground color can be quite effective there. What I would try and avoid is anything that changes the layout of the page. So for example, if when I move the mouse pointer over my heading, I change the font size. So I say font size, and let's make it really obviously bigger. So 36 pixels. Let's have a look what happens. So now H2, when I move my pointer over, it gets bigger and it changes colour. However, it pushes everything else down the page, and that looks a bit rubbish because you might accidentally catch those as you move your mouse pointer up and down the page. Now notice that the colour fades in slowly, but the size changes instantly, and that's because I've said my transition only applies to the colour. If I want it to apply to both, I can put all in there, and then if I refresh that, now we can see the size and the colour change gradually. So it's not quite as an unpleasant an effect, but it still does move things up and down. Notice that if you do take an amount of time to do things, you can have several changing size at once, and that kind of compounds the effect of things jumping about. So I wouldn't get things to change size. The same thing applies to even making things bold. You need to be a little bit careful. They're okay if they're in boxes, but just making text bold will have the effect of making it bigger, and italic can also make it a little bit bigger as well. So just be a little bit careful about what you change using the hover selector, but that can be quite a useful technique. If you wanted to style hyperlinks, as I've done there, hyperlinks are defined by an A tag. So you'd have A to say what color they were to begin with. You'd have A hover, which would say what it looks like when you move the mouse pointer over it. There is also a visited. So you might have noticed that some web pages, the links are a different color once you've already been there. So that's, again, a different thing that we can add from hover. So that's adding kind of a small degree of interactivity to your page using the hover selector.